the weather is very conducive to it. Where are those crops that were at risk last year, that had that yellow rust last year, and how close in proximity am I to those crops in terms of the following year? But remembering that actually it is a case that these spores originated not in Ireland, that they came a long distance, so that isn't going to be the solution to it, that actually you take it and say, I didn't have any yellow rust in my surrounding areas, I don't have to think about it. It is a case that you will, even in those scenarios, still have to monitor. And as I say then, if you're seeing it, that early prevention, that T0, to try and prevent yellow rust and try to prevent it from becoming a problem, is what I would say, is going to be critically important.
As the cereal planting season approaches, farmers are making important decisions about crop mixes and which varieties to sow. For many, the choices are guided by past experience, results from the recommended list, and whether there's an appetite to try something new or stick with a trusted variety. But one thing is certain, variety performance changes from year to year, and keeping up with those shifts is key. You're listening to the latest episode of the Tillage Edge with me, Michael Hennessy. We would really appreciate it if you could listen, follow, and give us a review on Apple or Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts from. This year, yellow rust in wheat has become a bigger challenge, and it could influence which varieties you decide to plant next season. This issue was a key focus at the Teagasc Crops Forum in Naas this week, where Dr. Stephen Kildea outlined the problem in detail and highlighted practical steps farmers can take to reduce this risk. If you missed the forum, Stephen's talk is well worth listening to.
We were getting reports that there was unusual yellow rust. It wasn't that it was unusual in how it was presenting itself, it was unusual in the crops that it was presenting itself. So we were finding it, or we were hearing that there was yellow rust in varieties such as your Champion, such as Dawson, but not only that, that it was actually from tradition, where you might have traditional areas of yellow rust, might be the northeast, the whole way down to the south, down into Cork, where I suppose yellow rust wouldn't really be a disease that would be spoken about. So clearly there was something unusual happening, but it wasn't just an Irish issue. As Carol mentioned, the HDB have changed their rates for yellow rust too. So there was something happening across, I suppose, Northern Europe, and I'll mention that in a minute. But this is quite alarming to a certain extent, because varieties such as Champion would have been very, very good from a yellow rust, and Dawson probably would have set the standard from a yellow rust. So clearly there was a breakdown in something, and Cara alluded to it there, in a YR15 gene. But as he mentioned, that it wasn't just unique to one variety. Pretty much every variety on the list had some level of yellow rust. There was absolutely varying degrees, and that is apparent and very clear from the variety recommended list there, where something like Champion is now a 4, where you might have something like Fitzroy that is now at a 7. So it's not a case that actually there's yellow rust isn't in some crops or isn't in some varieties and not in others. There's a possibility that yellow rust is across the board. Now, does that relate to the fact that maybe those varieties have YR15? We don't know specifically. We can take a guess that something like Champion and something like Dawson clearly had it, and we're relying really, really heavily on it. While something like Graham has previously, and we know that it has always succumbed to a certain amount of yellow rust. So clearly the strain isn't necessarily overcoming something there. And in that sort of scenario, is I suppose the yellow rust that we were seeing in Graham in 2025, is it related to the weather sort of aspects? So these are issues that I suppose we're trying to tease out and relating and working with colleagues across Europe to try and figure out, okay, what has happened and why are we actually seeing this, and what are we seeing? And I say, it was very apparent very early on, especially from the UK, because they were picking this up really early enough in spring in recommended list trials, specifically across the northern part of the country, and they were seeing it in those varieties, and they could see that actually it was related to those that would have YR15. Now they are at the moment looking through all their varieties to see, okay, what is relying on YR15, because it's not a case that some varieties might have YR15, but they may also have additional smaller genes or smaller sort of role genes that could have an impact and give you that difference in variety sort of resistance ratings that we are seeing. But as I say, it happened in the UK very quickly, and it's more than likely has emerged from a strain that already existed there. So it's not a case that it's a migrant coming in from outside. It's more than likely something that emerged there, overcome this specific gene or this specific resistance source, and has spread outwards from that. And it isn't just the case that it was an Irish-UK issue. This was being picked up in Belgium, in the Netherlands, in Denmark, and parts of France as the season went on. So, and I suppose this is probably part of looking at that and understanding why, understand how we might control this. because it was a case that it was progressing through the season. It wasn't a case that it was there at the very, very start, but it was an ongoing sort of problem that was emerging. And I take this from the point that we would have held a number of events at the end of March where actually the discussion about T0s was about Septoria. Fast forward 1 week later, where actually a lot of T0s probably would have been put on crops, and all of a sudden it was yellow rust was popping up in crops that wouldn't necessarily have required a T0 for Septoria. So it was an ongoing emergent sort of situation, and it leads us to the scenario that we're in the point now where, okay, how can we move forward and control it for 2026? And I think to do that, we need to look back to a certain extent and understand the conditions that allowed this strain, once it did emerge, to spread and develop. Because it isn't a case that actually once it spreads, it's an inevitability, or once it emerges, that's inevitability that that's it going to spread. Conditions also have to be right for its movement, for its infection, and for its development of the disease. The first thing, of course, is that actually, look, a majority of the varieties are now susceptible to it. Something like Champion, something like Dawson, that was able to control it, that this gene provided that resistance, are no longer resistant to this specific strain. Something like Graham, which is previously wasn't yellow rust resistant, it wasn't going to be a case that actually it became more susceptible, it's that it was already susceptible to it. So the majority of what we will be putting into the ground in the next few weeks are more than likely going to be susceptible to yellow rust if this strain survives over the winter months, which we anticipate that it would. But if, in terms of then allowing or providing or giving forward the development of the disease, mild winters would have allowed for its continuation. So imagine if this had emerged in the northeast of England or the north of England, probably around maybe September, October, November, then actually that mild sort of winter that we would have had to a certain extent wasn't too cold, wasn't a huge amount of frost nights, would have allowed that to tick over and develop early. And then, of course, we had an unusually dry and warm spring. And this really is the critical point for the development of that yellow rust. We don't typically get that, and especially down in Cork, where we were picking up yellow rust, it wouldn't typically be as dry or as warm. Now, when I say warm, I'm not talking into the high teens. I'm talking about your 8 to 12 to 13 degrees, maybe even 14 degrees. These are the ideal conditions for something like yellow rust to develop. So that will have promoted its development and spread, and hence we would have started to see this development in crops from about April onwards, or the end of March onwards. And just to really highlight that, we can actually see this just looking at the casement sort of data, because relating it back to, I suppose, the epidemic that was seen in Back Weston. You can clearly see that in temperature for spring, we're pretty much nearly every day was above the long-term mean. And not only just above it, was quite high. So you're looking at 12 degrees in March, and equally into April, well above that 10 degrees. And these are the conditions that are ideal. Now, yellow rust, if it gets up to that 18 degrees, it's going to stop. But that lower level, around that 10 to 12, 10 to 14, is ideal for it. The rainfall is not absolutely drastic. There's enough there to keep it going. It's moist, but the spores aren't going to be washed off those leaves. So it does need humidity, it does need moisture, but it cannot be washed off it. It'll be washed off it more easily than, say, Septoria, which is designed to actually utilise rain splash to move along. And then I suppose one of the other things I wanted to highlight was, look, where did they come from? And inevitably there was a large easterly wind flow. So undoubtedly we've had movement of these spores across the country, probably across, well, clearly across the sea, etc. So it was the ideal conditions in 2025 for yellow rust development in general. And then throw on top of that the risk that comes with the susceptibility of those varieties. So to a certain extent, it's not unusual that we would see that. In terms of the development. How can we control it? And I think I want to, just in the next couple of slides, talk about how we can control it. And I suppose yellow rust we would regard as a relatively easy disease to control. Fungicides in general will work. And I put up this slide just to highlight that, in that we had trial in Oak Park on Champion for T0 for Septoria control. At the time of application for the T0s, there was absolutely no yellow rust. So actually we look here and we see between the three T0s that we see no differences there, which tells me actually then our fungicide program that we would have applied, be that a Revistar followed by Univoc or Univoc followed by Revistar, where that pressure we were on before the yellow rust had developed, and where the pressure wasn't high at the very, very start, were providing us with sufficient control, very, very good levels of control. So it was a case that actually, look, we can control yellow rust. Compared to septoria, it is a relatively easy disease to control. Timing of application and the choice of active are critically important. And I would say that based on the more data that we would have from our trials in Oak Park, where we would have seen that actually for a septoria trial where we actually got some yellow rust and dawsum, we see that where the pressure isn't very high and wasn't very high, this is in the flag leaf, it's only about 10%, but it's given us an indication of what actually can there. We can see that actually the multi-site sulphur and fulpit provide absolutely no control of yellow rust. Everything else there on the list is providing very, very good control. Now this is low pressure, so what we want to avoid is high pressure, where we're putting all these under high pressure, and that is going to be key to how we do that. And I think that's where I put up here, look, something like the QOIs from an early application, they will provide that protection that is going to be required. Where you have high infection early on, it will require an azole treatment. But what is going to be critical is actually, okay, what crop is that? Are all crops high pressure very early on? Very, very unlikely. And that's the case even in this year where we had crops of Champion that had yellow rust. Basically, the neighbouring field of Champion wouldn't have had it. Understanding why that was the case is difficult to know, but what is absolutely important is that actually getting into the crop and monitoring and understanding what is there is vitally important. As I say, look, we don't have that high pressure data from a yellow rust perspective. Oak Park traditionally is not a yellow rust site. So we actually have looked at the AHDB curves going back over the last number of years, and I just mentioned there's 2 products on that aren't registered in Ireland. But of the other main products that we're looking at, you're looking at your Revistar and your Univoc, they are actually giving us very good levels of control. When you break down the individual products, okay, you can see your fenpicoxamide, your Initrec itself, by itself is not providing the best yellow rust control. Add in that azole interpathio, which is in your Univoc. Or equally, if you were in terms of the co-packs that would be there with your Pathio and TEB with your Initrec, they will provide that level of control. But again, it is important to understand that actually when you're trying to treat it, that it's making sure that you're trying not to put out a fire is really important in that sort of scenario. So that leaves me then to the risks for 2026, sort of the risk factor. Again, I go back to the HDB life cycle that the HDB have there. What's critical for yellow rust is going to be how this overwinters, and equally then how this spring is going to be from a temperature-wise and a rainfall type of perspective. And I say overwinters, we can look at it and say, okay, how will it overwinter? We don't know if we don't know if there's a secondary phase. I don't believe there is one in Ireland, so it's actually going to be surviving as the Kildea, and that is going to be on volunteers. So the green bridge from a yellow rust perspective is going to be important. So if you've had a case where you had a lot of yellow rust, you had a lot of yellow rust in your field of Champion, that actually the next crop that's going to go in next door to that is going to be a field of Champion. You can expect that actually there will be possibly carryover between one to the other. So in that type of scenario, you have to be aware that actually, okay, my Champion next door to this could well get yellow rust very, very early on. In that type of scenario, do you need to be changing to one of those more resistant varieties? But being aware that actually they're not completely resistant. Again, is that a case where you were increasing that inoculum from the very, very start? These are things that we do need to think about. But as I say, it's going to come back down to the variety, the susceptibility. As I say, we all have some level of susceptibility there now. Later sowing crops will be at a greater risk. And that is basically from the aspect that we know that as it moves into that spring type of form, into spring, that actually the weaker the crop is and the more juvenile the crop is, the more risk it is going to be at from a yellow rust perspective. As I say, the winter and spring, what weather is happening there will be critical. If we've some hard frosts, this will knock back those overwintering spores dramatically. Will it completely stop it? It's unlikely, but it will knock it well back, that actually the levels that we have as we move into the spring will be quite low. And that relates back to understanding that actually, okay, if the weather is very conducive to it, where are those crops that were at risk last year, that had that yellow rust last year, and how close in proximity am I to those crops in terms of the following year? But remembering that actually it is a case that these spores originated not in Ireland, that they came a long distance. So that isn't going to be the solution to it, that actually you take it and say, I didn't have any yellow rust in my surrounding areas, I don't have to think about it. It is a case that you will, even in those scenarios, still have to monitor. And as I say then, if you're seeing it, that early prevention, that T0, to try and prevent yellow rust and try to prevent it from becoming a problem, is what I would say is going to be critically important. So with that, I suppose, with that, just put together sort of a flow to try and give an idea, okay, what should we be looking at? And I say, if we have that susceptible variety, and there's quite a few of them on that list there now that are quite susceptible, is it a case that actually early spring there is yellow rust present? And that's a scenario where that is going to need a treatment of a T0. It's going to require one that is very active against yellow rust. Azole or a QOI in that type of scenario. Possibly an azole or a multi-site. Again, coming back to the susceptibility of the variety. If there's no yellow rust present when you walk that, is it a case that it's free? I think in those sort of susceptible varieties, I still would be putting out that T0 to try and control it. I think the risk there is probably too big in that it could be a case that, okay, I walked it today, I didn't see any yellow rust, come back maybe 2.5 weeks later into my leaf tree application, and all of a sudden yellow rust is there. The risk is probably too high in those susceptible varieties not to do something. In that sort of scenario, a QOI to give us that type of protection going out is probably enough in that sort of case. The second group then, as I say, are that moderately resistant type of variety. There could well be a case where there's yellow rust present in those. If that's the case, they're going to require a T0. Again, that could be an azole or the QOI, including with that multi-site. No yellow rust present in those. That is a question, do these require it? And I think what's most important there is going to be monitoring these and saying, okay, what are the conditions? How has the winter months fared? How has early spring fared? Have that been really conducive to the development of the disease? Is there actually yellow rust around in that type of scenario? If they're not favourable to it, then actually I'd be saying, okay, maybe not so much of a risk in that sort of case. But it really will depend on what happens over those months. Because, as I say, we don't have that level of resistance that the champion and the Dawson did have. They were providing us some very, very good resistance where we didn't have to think about yellow rust early on. We were thinking mostly about septoria. As I say then, when we do actually get into the main part of our programme, it is going to be for septoria control. And assuming that we have taken care that this has all been done from a yellow rust perspective, the septoria type products and the septoria type treatments that we will be doing at leaf tree and onto our flag leaf should keep yellow rust out. But again, it is going to be a case, if we're trying to do a fire brigade job at this, then you are going to specifically need to include specific rust actives. And then this sort of a scenario, then some of the SDHIs, such as your lattice in the form of salatinol, would be a very, very good inclusion product in there. Okay, so it's been a very quick run through, but I just want to sort of thank a number of people, look, Deirdre and the team in Oak Park, NIAB. I've been in contact with NIAB about, I suppose, this evolving picture, and thanks to Kostya for providing the photograph and providing some information. And then just to give it information, I think back in March I would have mentioned a few of you that actually, look, there's a project called IPM Arama. It's been conducted and coordinated by a colleague, Dan Milburn. Part of that is actually yellow rust. So there is an active monitoring of yellow rust being conducted. We have submitted about 15 samples from Cork through to the northeast to that, and we're still waiting for feedback to come from it. Look, we expect that the majority of the samples that we have put in there will be virulent strains to YR15. But it is something that with this information, we're starting to build up more of a picture and gain more information from what's actually happening throughout Europe. So it will be a case of next year, look, if you do come across yellow rust, let us know and we can forward that information, put it up onto the tracker, and equally provide the guys in Denmark with samples where they'll be able to pathotype for us. Okay.
So that's it for today, and my thanks to Stephen for his contribution to the Crops Forum. We'll be back next week with more from the Crops Forum, where we'll feature a talk from Richie Hackett in Teagasc, where he outlines the best agronomic practice to grow high-yielding rye. If you enjoyed the podcast, then recommend it to a friend or colleague, and as always, rate, review and follow on Apple or Spotify so you never miss an episode. And for more information, go to teagasc.ie. I'm Michael Hennessy, thanks for listening, and I'll be back next week with more tillage news and advice.